I want to introduce our third podium speaker to you this afternoon, Paul Kershaw, another one of our faculty members at the Human Early Learning Partnership. Paul is a farmer at sunrise and sunset, morning and night, a professor at UBC during the daytime. He is also increasingly on the road doing public speaking and contributing to some dialogue in the media. Many of you may have read Paul's recent contributions in The Sun, Think Like a Beaver, heard him on the radio the last couple of weeks, and he's going to talk a lot more to you about that. So, Paul Kershaw.
Thank you, Joanne. Ladies and gentlemen, when you follow two great speakers like Tom and Clyde, it's always a pleasure to come and listen to them in advance and think, oh, okay, I got to change what I'm going to say in the light of what they've already shared with you. And so I want to actually do something slightly different than I planned, and it's going to begin with a new introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul Kershaw, and I am recovering from about a half dozen years of talking about the research, the brilliant research that Clyde and Tom just shared with us. I've been talking about it ineffectively. That bugs me because when you think about health's role of doing research from cell through to society, I'm one of the faculty members who operates more on the society side, talking about what happens globally and how that's influencing Canada and our provinces. And to Adrian's point earlier, at that national and regional level, we know a great deal about the kinds of policies that could actually address some of the factors that are happening in our national and regional environments. And we've just heard from Tom and Clyde that that matters a great deal because those surrounding outer circles put in place the enabling conditions for the families to interact and opt with their children, to optimize the environments in which those children are first exposed to early on. And so if, for instance, we know that more and more families are struggling because of social and economic changes with respect to having too little time, we can do something about that. We know if families are struggling with income, there are ways to deal with that too. If there's a service shortage, we know how to build services. And yet, despite all of that, despite knowing these things and doing research over the last 15 years to discuss that, to examine it, the way I've been talking about it, at least, has been insufficient to really move the dial. And we have no better evidence than that, than Clyde's own words, that for the last decade, despite all the great research we've been doing in this province, we haven't seen the early development instrument vulnerability rate improve. Which has made me think, well, how do I talk about that data? And I want to walk you through briefly a Coles Note version of what I used to say. I would start with a pretty picture like this, featuring very purposefully a young girl or a young boy, hopefully pulling at your heartstrings and showcasing that 31% of BC's young children who look just like this young girl arrive at school vulnerable, either physically, socially, emotionally, or in terms of their language and cognitive development. And then I would go right into the next piece of data that we know. Most of those children who come to school struggling are not income poor. They reside in middle and upper income households and neighborhoods. And so much of that vulnerability is avoidable. We could make different decisions in society to support our families differently, to allow them to optimize the environments in which their children are growing up. If we choose not to do that, we've heard from Clyde and Tom today, and Clyde's voice stayed with him, that if we don't avoid that early vulnerability in the first years of life, we're going to watch children in our population struggle with health problems throughout their later decades. And indeed, having the opportunity in British Columbia to follow an entire population of children move from kindergarten to grade 4, and then from grade 4 through to grade 7, and from grade 7 through to grade 12, and or into the interaction with the criminal justice system. We know now that so long as we tolerate so much more vulnerability above 10%, we are literally condemning an extra third of that young generation to prison. And we know by the same data that so long as we tolerate so much more vulnerability early on, so much more than 10%, we are literally throwing away the potential for an extra third of that young generation to get the kinds of grades when they leave high school that would allow them to go to our best post-secondary institutions. And given that we know how the early years affect school leaving, we know that the more school-ready kids are in kindergarten, the more likely they're to leave job-ready when they graduate, we can start to see and estimate how the early years influence later economic growth in a society. And if any of you remember some of the 15 by 15 research I talked about a couple of years ago, you'll know that we say, if we could just get it right with our public policy and bring early vulnerability down in our province to around 10%, and let those children play well and have the childhood they deserve, by the time they leave school and become a growing part of the labor supply, they will increasingly more and more grow our economy over their working lives by an extra 20 percentage points of GDP. And were they to do that, it's akin to injecting right now in our economy, just in BC alone, an extra $400 billion of investment. When we started that research, it was 10 times the size of the provincial debt. That's the kind of brain drain that we were talking about, 10 times the provincial debt. Now, over time, I started to recognize more and more that that kind of analysis, focusing on how to prevent crime down the road, how to get school results better, how to promote economic growth, without doubt, it's going to run into challenges because those are long-term outcomes. And in our political world, leaders need to get voted in every 3 or 4 years. So there's a challenge between talking about long-term investments and the realities of our electoral politics. We knew that going in, but we still think the evidence is important and compelling, and we have to ask citizens to think longer term. But what I didn't expect so much is that same kind of evidence ran aground in one of Canada's most impressive characteristics. Many, many citizens, including in this room, hold firmly to the value of personal responsibility. Some of us will say there is more dignity at the end of a shovel than at the end of a handout. But this notion of personal responsibility is a value that cuts both ways. Because when people are struggling, that commitment to personal responsibility in our society often leads us to saying, oh, if you're struggling, you made poor decisions. This even plays out with respect to early years in citizens' life, when it isn't necessarily the young child making poor decisions, but it could very well be their parents. And so, last year, in 2010, when the Human Early Learning Partnership launched its 2010 round of early development instrument data, we were engaging with the media, and the media one day called our best spokesperson. They talked to Clyde. Clyde, who perhaps better than any other person I know on this continent, who can talk about the ins and outs of the early development instrument data, who can talk about what the child vulnerability we are witnessing means here at home and across the continent, who can make sure that we understand it is about the interaction of our genes with our environments in the home, but also environments far greater than that, that influence what goes on in the home. And yet, despite that, the headline that appeared on the front page of our provincial paper said as follows: why can't Johnny read? Maybe it's his parents' fault. For me, that was a watershed moment. It was a watershed moment which demanded that I ask myself, what is going on? This is great research, great data, and its implications tell a very different story than was just interpreted by that media engagement. So I started to think more and more, what is happening? What is happening when researchers showcase so beautifully, as both Tom and Clyde did earlier this afternoon, that these early years matter? Well, one of the things that happens is that it's giving rise to greater expectations. Parents and society more generally are hearing, yes, These first years of a child's life matter. We've got to get it right. If we don't get it right, we risk problems just like I showcased. You might go to jail. They might not get into university. They might become sick. But when we create those sets of expectations in a cultural context so committed to personal responsibility, one of the things we do is we create a scenario whereby we invite personal blame. And so in collaboration with colleagues I see around the room, some from the United Way, some from the YWCA, some from Vancouver Foundation, a number of us set out to better understand how are we being heard when we talk about the early years. And we worked with a group at McAllister Opinion Research, including their CEO, Angus. And you're going to hear me refer to Angus a few times. And Angus said, look, we need to sit down and hear what parents think and just talk about when we put out the question, what's it like to be a parent today? And let me give you a recap of some of the things we heard. What's it like to be a parent today? Imagine 6 young women sitting around a table. Person 1, I better get in here so I can read it. Her name's Helen. She says, you're trying to do so many different things with your kids. Get them in activities. Make sure they're not watching too much TV. She carries on, I find it hard to meet expectations. Your expectations, their expectations, society's expectations. It's not just one set of expectations. There's pressure to be perfect. And then imagine 5 other women nodding in unanimity. Tara chimes in, finding the time to be a good parent, balancing work, trying to find the right way to balance everything, especially in the younger years when you first start trying to discipline. You don't have any experience, so how do you know? Dale chimes in, I find it doesn't matter what I'm doing. I feel like I'm doing a half-assed job. I feel like I have trouble being present. Whatever I'm doing, I feel guilty that I should be over here in this other area. I always wonder if I'm doing right by my child. Angus, the facilitator of these conversations, says, how would you summarize what you've all said? Kristen chimes in, to me, it's all about the expectations. To me, it's about my own expectations that are the biggest pressure, but the expectations of strangers too. And she goes on to tell a story about how a woman said something really rude to her when her child had a bit of a temper tantrum in public. And again, you have 5 other women nodding in agreement. Helen, I totally agree that's true. We're a generation of, are we doing that right? There's books out there, but who has time to read 100 different books on parenting? To which Clyde and Tom just contributed chapters this afternoon. Leanne ends the conversation by saying the standard division of labor doesn't work anymore. Even if the 2 adults are willing to have one stay at home, you can't manage a household on one income anymore. Then there's also this whole market that's been built around parenting. We're also subject to so many discourses about how to be a good parent, how not to F up your kid. I don't think my parents, I think they lacked a lot of information, but at least they weren't bogged down by information. I'm constantly questioning every single aspect of parenting my children, and that doesn't seem normal to me. That doesn't feel normal. And yet, I've built a career on doing just that. Look what's happened as a result, quite out of keeping with what my intentions are. The research, as it's been communicated from world-leading organizations like the Human Early Learning Partnership, is adding to the pressure that parents feel. It's adding to the guilt they feel. It's adding to uncertainty they feel in their decisions. It is adding to a sense of information overload and a sense of weighty expectations. And then imagine throwing in the term child vulnerability into that context. Even if you hadn't mentioned it before, even if you hadn't told them how many kids are vulnerable, you just talk about children being vulnerable generally. Look at the kind of responses you elicit as a result. Oh, it must be because parents aren't spending enough time with their children. Children are spoiled, maybe with money, but not love. Could it be as a result of the childcare? Who's looking after them? Parents are just outsourcing responsibility for the kids. They're not taking responsibility. A lot of kids come home to an empty house. And so to be provocative, Angus, in the middle of this conversation, to get a better sense of what's the context into which people like me bring research, put forward the question, could you just be worse parents today? Or could it be the environment generally? And some actually answered, listen to Anthony, I would go with worse parents. Angus asks, why are you a worse parent, Anthony? Anthony, I'm saying on average. You laugh, but notice what happened. We just divided parents. The very group of people really we most want to mobilize together to say, we need to change what's going on in our country to make it easier once again to raise a family because it has become far harder. We just divided them. And we incline some people to say, I'm okay, but most other parents must be doing a poor job. And so it makes me think that talking about child vulnerability, or at least starting a conversation by talking about child vulnerability, even starting a dialogue about talking about how children are doing is very, very risky in our cultural context. It risks setting up a conversation that will trigger a range of cultural narratives that are likely to invoke guilt and people blaming individuals as opposed to thinking about what's going on more broadly in the social and economic environment around them. And so in collaboration with McAllister Opinion Research, increasingly trying to think through how do we start a different journey for the data that we are producing at the Human Early Learning Partnership? How do you tell the same information but get it talked about differently? And some of the advice that Angus, the CEO of McAllister Opinion Research, gave me that has really stuck is you need to start a conversation where you wish to end. Now, hands up in the room, people who are academics. Tom, hands up, please. Hands up. Thank you very much. Okay. This is a very frightening thing to be told as an academic. Our business is to follow where the data go. Our business is not to come into place with a story that we know we want to tell before we even do the research. This message from the communications person said, first for me was a no-go. I'm like, I can't do that. It's not what my job's about. Other people can do that. But it got me to thinking, perhaps a researcher has no need to abandon the data, only how we use them. And more, the fundamental thing that I'm deciding to do with data is figure out what story does the data tell me I need to tell. But that doesn't necessarily mean I start with or ever use the data to tell it. What do I mean by that? Well, before I met Angus, the story I thought the data was telling, all the evidence was showing, went something like this. Almost a third of our kids are vulnerable. So much of that is avoidable, especially once you start to recognize most of the kids who are vulnerable, they ain't income poor. How are we going to go about doing that? Well, we have to ask ourselves, what's changed in our society such that the conditions for over a third of the population make it that getting it right in the early years is harder and harder. And part of that means we require policy change to address those factors. That's particularly the case in Canada because international organizations like UNICEF and the OECD showcase that Canada ranks amongst the very worst industrialized countries when it comes to investing in families with kids under age 6. Now that was the general story that I thought I was telling in the light of the data. But if it's important to start stories where you want them to end, then suddenly I had to ask myself, what does it mean as a researcher to start talking at the very outset of a conversation about a story about policy change, systems change? And so I want to walk you through some of the different kind of evidence I now highlight when trying to have the same conversation that I once wanted to do over the last 6 years. And I draw attention to this slide. What do people see on it? Hands up, audience participation, please. Okay, everybody's bashful. Some tired people. What else do you see? Happy seeing you. No. What matters to me are two things on this slide. Notice it's an emblem of Canada. There's very significant Canadian symbols there. It's our flag. And it uses the word generational. It very purposefully talks about an aggregation, not an individual child, not an individual family. Why is that important? Because at the end of the day, I think the research tells us that the solutions we need to put in place come just as much at this aggregated level as they do anywhere else. And if that's the conversation I want to have with people, Angus tells me I need to start there. And so here's the kind of information I start to think about in order to launch that conversation. And it's one that matters in our context where, in the middle of a global economic recession, we so often talk about constraint. And there are constraints today globally. But that conversation risks obscuring a very important fact. Between 1976 and today, even after you adjust for inflation, our economy in this country doubled in size. It now produces an extra $35,000 per household on average. Which begs a bit of the question, where is all that additional prosperity going? One part of the answer is most certainly not to the generation raising young kids. Because for that generation, the standard of living is in significant decline. Between 1976 and today, across this country, after adjusting for inflation, there has been no significant gain in household income for young couples, the very age where we're talking about rearing young kids. Those incomes are stalled even though we have far more young women contributing employment income today than we did a generation ago. And with that stagnant household income, those young couples across our country need to pay for far higher housing prices that have doubled across the country, well, nearly doubled. And in our province, gone up 149%. Those changes mean that we are talking about a generation that is squeezed. It is squeezed for time at home. It is squeezed for income, even when they're technically not poor because of the skyrocketing costs of housing. And they are squeezed for services like childcare that would allow them to balance time on the job, which is necessary to pay for that rising cost of housing, with time at home. Now, I want to just showcase for you in a moment of utmost honesty, I just shared with you Canadian data. Because when I've gone into other groups, especially in BC, and just showcased BC data, I ran headfirst again into this personal responsibility context. Because people said, oh, we choose to live here, despite all of the costs. So we know it's expensive. And so we got off again on a conversation about how individuals are just making bad choices for their kids. When this is not a BC or even a Vancouver-specific story, it is the reality of our country, which is just particularly difficult in our province. So where's all that additional prosperity going? Well, interestingly, right now, we are witnessing with the evolution of the Occupy movements, first from Wall Street and then spreading across North America and the globe, a different kind of answer. We have, for the first time in a long time, more and more people talking about growing income inequality between the rich and the rest. We are the 99% is a very powerful slogan. It showcases that the 1%, even in Canada, takes home 14% of income. And that same 1% definitely does benefit from a disproportionate share of the growth in income over the last decade. But this dynamic, I think, also risks misconstruing some issues. I mean, when you talk about the 1%, what we're saying is that there's a few fat cat corporate bankers who are gorging off the cream produced by a group, a hardworking group of helpless little white mice churning the milk. But that discussion ignores some really important generational realities. Who is rich in our society? Well, if you go back and look at how things have changed over generations, while it has become harder to raise a family across our country, it certainly has become far easier to retire. Compared to those about to retire a generation ago, incomes are up 20% in BC. And more importantly than that, wealth has gone up for those about to retire in ways we don't talk about. If you're trying to get into the housing market today after prices have nearly doubled, that's not so good. That's hard. But if you happen to have a house back in the late 70s or early 80s, even if you were paying higher interest rates back then, it turns out just through that practice of home ownership, your wealth has gone up remarkably. Allowing people to transform our expectations for retirement such that globe-trotting and a second vacation home is, not for everyone, but more and more the norm. And then there's some more sinister things that are happening. That very group of people who are retiring are leaving larger government debts and arguably larger environmental debts. So there is emerging in our society growing inequality that's not simply about a few fat cats gorging on the cream, but more generally some difficulties that are emerging through a tension between generations. And it's not necessarily the fault of any individual or even individual generation, but the tension without doubt exists. And I think talking about that tension matters. Because on one hand, it is about redefining who is wealthy. And if everyone else is wealthy except me, then it doesn't ever ask us to look in the mirror and say, what do we have and how well are we doing and so on, and is it just about the 1%? But more than that, those who are doing better with incomes approaching retirement and have more wealth in their housing, unlike fat cats who aren't going to care about some hungry white mice, they care about the generations who follow. They love their children and grandchildren. You're far more likely to get a bunch of boomers to argue for a better deal for their kids and grandkids than you will ever get those fat mas to care about the hungry white mice. And also, when we talk about fat cats, you talk about a group of people who in our cultural context, so committed to personal responsibility, can sometimes, have others around them say, well, they earned it. They worked hard, they made a good invention, they made a good investment, they earned it. And we have this dream in Canada and in the United States that we too one day can earn the opportunity to maybe get close to that 1%. And that cultural context has meant that we don't talk that often until recently about income inequality, and we don't necessarily do it with a great deal of commitment. But when you talk about generations, no one who came of age in the 1970s earned the luck of good timing. No one earned the luck of coming of age as a young adult when wages were still on the rise, including for men. When you had an undergraduate degree that meant you would get a return on your investment in that education because you could compete with someone who didn't have an undergraduate degree but had 10 years of experience. Who came of age when housing was affordable but went up by 76% throughout their lives across our country. You didn't earn those things. And so we can draw attention and say those things are going on, those luxuries no longer exist, wages really aren't on the rise. In particular, men's wages are struggling in lots of places, including in resource sectors. Housing is far more unaffordable. And so what we've got are social and economic trends which suggest those who follow the baby boomer generation are getting a bit of a bad deal. Or put it differently, Canada is no longer working for all generations. Canada is no longer working for all generations. And one way we know that is to go back to a place I started. You can go to the international evidence, and you can see that organizations like UNICEF rank Canada at the bottom of the industrialized barrel. And that failure to invest in policy for families with young kids is simply out of step with our proud tradition of building and adapting social policy in response to our environment. By 1970, we had spent nearly a century building public schools and universities, building veterans insurance, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance. In one single year, 1966, we invested and started our Canada Public Pension Plan and our Canada Medical Care Act. Now, that is a proud policy tradition, one that set up a policy infrastructure really well suited to the social and economic environment of the day. So successful, it managed to wrestle down poverty rates amongst seniors that in the mid-70s were up to almost 30% of seniors being poor. But today, it is less than 5%. Problem, though, is you can only rest on your policy laurels for so long. At some point, you have to ask this fundamental question: what have we done since? And the answer on the social policy side, if you look at the history books, is not very little. And this is especially true with respect to adapting to the social and economic environment that's very different for young people today than it was a generation ago. And so while we have worked to maintain the same policies, the water behind our national dam has changed in type, in height, and in pressure. And in the 1970s, it started to put a little crack. By the 80s, the crack grew into an actual gap. By today, it's a darn big flood. And who is caught up in it? The generation raising young kids and 31% of our children. Telling that policy story matters. Telling it matters because for the generation raising young kids today, they did not grow up in a context where we made major social policy changes. And as a result, they have no memory of it. And when you have no memory, it turns out that you have less imagination about what we could do. And so, although the generation raising young kids and the boomer generation about to retire, all of them agree people are more time crunched at home today. Housing is more expensive. There's a shortage of services. But few of us are actually thinking, well, if time's a shortage, we could change public policy to make it not cost the equivalent of a second mortgage to have two parents share time at home with a newborn. We could do that. We could change our parental leave system. Or if there's a service shortage, well, we know how to create a system of child care services and make it affordable and make it high quality and pay the people who perform the work wages that are akin to the education we expect them to have, not akin to what we pay parking lot attendants. And while we can't necessarily change the market for housing, we can, as I said before, make sure other costs don't add up to second and third mortgages, which right now, even when you take advantage of our parental leave system to be home with a child aged 3 to 15 months, you're foregoing about $15,000 of disposable income to do it. That is a second mortgage in the year. And if you want to buy childcare in our province, even when researchers like me say the quality is not necessarily that good, you're paying upwards of $8,000 to $10,000, even $11,000, depending on how young the child is. Again, akin to a second mortgage just for one kid. And so it's for that reason that increasingly I think our country needs to move from a bad deal to a new deal for families. And we need the baby boomer generation to ask for that better deal on behalf of their kids and grandchildren. But to do that, you have to be careful. You see, all I've done today is drawn attention to an intergenerational tension. But when you draw attention to that, you risk being heard in a way where you're instantly putting blame. And for better or for worse, you don't want to blame a group of baby boomers. Now, you don't want to blame a group of baby boomers because it turns out you don't want to anger people who in our society actually happen to still have their hands on the levers of power, either in terms of government or in our boardrooms, or they're better at playing politics, they get out to vote more, and they're getting baby boomer political party leaders responding to their needs. But it also turns out, and where's Amy? Amy, my good friend and colleague at HELP. Amy, thank you very much, Amy. Amy also reminded me the other day when I didn't emphasize this in our office, that you risk alienating the very generation of young kids, very generation of young people raising young kids, I should say, who really appreciate boomers. And I want to introduce you to the very beginning of the first conversation I had with parents as part of my work with Angus McAllister at McAllister Opinion Research. And the way Angus started the conversation, he needed an icebreaker, he said, "Who inspires you?" In this case, it was 6 guys sitting around a room. 4 of the 6 guys answered like this. On a personal level, I look up to my dad. That's about it. Stephen, I would also say my father. He's a very selfless person, and I very much look up to him. Randy, the person who inspires me, is also my dad. Not because he's the perfect person, but he's pretty rough around the edges. But he's got a really good heart, and that's pretty important. What we have in Canada is something I don't think we talk enough about. We have a really filial society. We have a group of people who love and admire their parents, and never, ever do we want to disrupt that. That is impressive. We've got a generation who appreciates what their parents did for them in the past when they were young kids, and in some instances now the help they're getting from their parents, either with housing costs or childcare, etc. And so I would argue what we need to do is, if we want to tell a story about policy and changing policy, you've got to mobilize people to think about how do we change policy. And it turns out that leaving responsibility with the generation raising young kids is actually a pretty safe way to go in a conversation. Because I've already showed you the weight of expectations they feel has already primed them to feel responsibility. And so, here's what I would suggest. You can earn the trust of the generation raising young kids today and mobilize them to think about using their political voices differently by engaging a bit of myth-busting. Oftentimes we'll hear that the generation raising young kids is lazy. That's rubbish. They work more paid hours and perform more unpaid hours than any other group of Canadians today. Sometimes we say that they're consumerist, and as a result we're implying they have poor values because they have fancy phones like me in their pocket. But when these people are putting so much time into the labor market, they are doing so because they're on a hamster wheel. They have to run faster and faster and faster to keep up with housing prices, even though wages aren't keeping up. But the hamster wheel itself is not moving. So that's not about consumerism. In fact, the generation raising young kids isn't the group of people buying the granite countertops and building the big fancy homes. They're buying the fixer-uppers and the condos that have no yard. Now that is a major change in a generation. But where you can start to draw attention to a little bit of laziness on the generation raising young kids is they have bought into their name Generation X, and they have exited formal politics. We have made it a badge of honor to say that it doesn't matter if I vote. Politics aren't about me, and so we don't. We are a third less likely to vote than the generation older than us. You want to know why the generation raising young kids is getting a bad deal? Because others play politics more effectively. And even the Occupy Wall Street movement is interesting. People walk a long way to make a protest, but we're not so good at walking at strategic moments to the ballot box. So the new deal for families to get new mom and dad benefits, $10 a day childcare, put that in a context of flex time, which will make sure we no longer make it standard practice to have employment norms that ignore the family. To get there, we need people to reprioritize. And especially in the generation raising young kids, we need them to care less about who's being voted off some island and care more about who's being voted into our legislatures in Victoria and in Ottawa. Because we just witnessed in our country a dismal, dismal sign of democracy slipping, whereby in Ontario, the biggest province, voter turnout fell below 50% for the first time, I believe, since Confederation. Now, my time is up, and I want to leave time for questions, and I have much more to say about how would you talk about a range of policy changes that we know could address the time squeeze, the income squeeze, and the service squeeze. And if your questions are interested in that, we can go in that direction. But at the end, I want to simply emphasize that what we are talking about is no less fundamental than the question, what kind of Canada do we want? Is it one that we will continue to ignore the intergenerational breach? Or is it one which I'm sure most Canadians buy into? One where we will recommit to once again working for all generations. Thank you.